Hello everyone. Since we're going to be doing some analysis of literature, I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and introduce some literary terms to you. And so that's what I plan on doing in this presentation. Because I do know that a lot of students are not very familiar with the kinds of terms or the kinds of techniques or even structures that build or are the foundation of a lot of the texts that they find entertaining. And so for this presentation, we'll be focusing on the elements of storytelling. So let's get started. First, let's start with the basic, plot. Essentially, plot is what happens in the story. It's the beginning, the middle, and the end. All stories typically have an exposition where the scene is set, the characters are introduced, and so is the conflict. Speaking of conflict, the complication. Stories are, of course, need to have conflict usually in order for them to be entertaining or in order to catch viewers or readers' attention. Also, most stories will have some form of resolution, where the conflict is resolved or not resolved, which is also a choice that some artists can use when it comes to creating their stories. So when it comes to all three of these, we do need to think about how the artist actually uses these to their advantage when it comes to creating a story, and should the artist actually depart from any of these, we also might want to think about why they might make that choice. Next, we have two terms that students often get confused with, like bad guys or good guys, but that's not exactly what they are. In fact, protagonist and antagonist are actually a lot more precise. There are two characters, or even groups of characters, who act as either the protagonist or the antagonist of the story. Essentially, the protagonist is the character or group of characters who are trying to accomplish a goal or set of goals. The antagonist is the character or group of characters who are trying to prevent the protagonist from accomplishing their goals. And so, as you can see, when it comes to the protagonist and antagonist, they don't necessarily say anything about morals. What all they say is essentially who is seeking to accomplish a goal, and who is seeking to prevent the other characters from accomplishing that goal. That's the true difference between a protagonist and an antagonist. I've also got two terms here at the bottom that are also interesting for a lot of students to know. So for instance, we have a hero. Now, a hero is a character who exhibits ideal traits, usually things like bravery, skill, idealism, or even a sense of purpose. Or we can also have an anti-hero. This is the opposite of a hero, who is a character with the same lofty goals as the hero, but is lacking in some way that will prevent them from accomplishing those goals. And here are some examples of protagonists and antagonists. The first two, Harry Potter and Voldemort, and Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, are traditional kinds of pairings of protagonists and antagonists. You've got the protagonist, Harry Potter and Luke Skywalker, attempting to thwart or prevent the antagonist, either Voldemort or Darth Vader, from essentially taking over the world. And so those are essentially the traditional kinds of protagonist and antagonist pairings, and they typically align with the bad guy and good guy kinds of moral leanings. However, we also have an example here at the bottom from the series Breaking Bad, where we have Walter White, who is the protagonist of the series, and Hank Schrader, who is one of the antagonists of the series. Now, Walter White, as he becomes a methamphetamine kingpin, becomes essentially an immoral monster throughout the entire as the series develops. Whereas Hank Schrader, who plays the DEA agent who's trying to find and catch him, would traditionally be considered the quote-unquote good guy. However, we have however, in the way the series is set up, that is not the case. Walter White is the protagonist because he's the one who has the goal that we are following, and Hank Schrader is the antagonist because he's trying to prevent Walter White from accomplishing his goals. So definitely do not try to confuse protagonist with good guy and antagonist with bad guy. That is not typically how they will often align. All right, so protagonists and antagonists are not aligned to moral values. They just say basically, who's the main character that we're watching achieve a goal, and who's the one who's preventing that main character from actually accomplishing that goal. So definitely try to keep those those terms distinct. The next couple of terms are called climax and denouement. The climax of a story is the point of greatest tension, when the fate of all involved, all the characters, is decided. So the climax is essentially, if you were watching an action film, it'd be the gigantic explosion that essentially meant the antagonist's death, or even the point where everything else after that is essentially just resolution. So that's what the climax of the story is going to be. Denouement is what follows the climax, and it is typically the term that is used to refer to the resolution of the story. Take, for example, Star Wars and Return of the Jedi. While oftentimes in the first Star Wars film, A New Hope, the blowing up of this Death Star would definitely be considered the climax of the story. In Return of the Jedi, however, it actually appears a little bit earlier than the explosion of the second Death Star. In fact, I would argue that the climax of the story is when Darth Vader decides to rebel against the Emperor and save his son, Luke Skywalker. And when, of course, he does that, he takes the Emperor and throws him down some giant shaft. And, of course, that's what precipitates a huge explosion of force energy, essentially. It's that moment that is the climax of the story, because for the most part we've had a conflict between whether or not Darth Vader is good or bad, or whether or not he has morals, or whether or not his son can save him. And it's at this point that we actually find out that he can actually save him, and that Darth Vader does have some moral leanings towards the good side, or the light side of the Force. Everything else that happens after this is essentially just resolution of the story. It is the denouement. Next up, we have some other narrative techniques and terms. So, for example, in media res, which is Latin for in the midst of things, it refers to a narrative that begins in the middle of the story. It's where the narrative then fills the audience in on what happened before the start of the story. A flashback occurs when the memory of a past event that a character will relive or is re-experiencing. The whole point of a flashback is that the character is essentially kind of like reliving it in that moment, or re-experiencing a past event. Foreshadowing is a small clue that can point towards a future events. Essentially, is a way of allowing the readers to kind of predict what is going to happen next. It can be anything from a small detail that the writer includes, or it can be even like a character's word choice. It's essentially anything that kind of points towards future events in the narrative. I have 3 examples here of the terms that we just went over. The first one, in media res, comes from Star Wars: A New Hope. As you can see from the GIF that's in this slide, we actually see essentially 2 battleships at war with each other, or fighting over each other. And in the moment, we have no idea what is going on, or who's fighting whom, and what the conflict is. It's essentially we're thrown in the middle of a battle. And that's exactly what in media res is. It's only after this battle, as the story progresses, that we learn more about the conflict. In the second GIF I have here, it comes from the film Ratatouille, where we actually do have the food critic, who's one of the film's antagonists, trying one of Remy's dishes, and the dish happens to be ratatouille. And it is so good that it actually throws him back into a past memory where his mother would make ratatouille in order to make himself feel better. So it's a wonderful example of a flashback. And in the third example here of foreshadowing, I have The Dark Knight, where we have the character Harvey Dent actually saying, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain." This is an exact example of foreshadowing, because that's exactly what happens to Harvey Dent. He does become the villain by the end of the film. When it comes to any literary text, point of view is very important. It'll actually help you decide how to approach the analysis. So a point of view describes what type of role that the narrator plays in the events of the story, and then also includes any limits placed on his or her knowledge of the events. The narrator is whoever is just telling the story. This can be one of the characters actually participating in the story, or it can be somebody or a narrator who is just telling the story from kind of like an omniscient perspective. In fact, we do have first-person narrator, which is indicated by the narrator's use of I, which can either be a major or minor character, but they usually act as a witness to the events of the story. A third-person narrator is usually indicated by the narrator's use of pronouns like he or she. And there can be different kinds of third-person narrators, where we have an all-knowing or omniscient narrator who sees into all the characters' thinking and knows everything that's going on at all times. We can also have a limited omniscience, where we see only into maybe one character, or we have an objective narrator who does not see into any characters in terms of their thinking, but just reports on events from the outside. Now, this next question is going to be very important when reading Poe's The Telltale Heart, and you should ask this question: Is the narrator trustworthy? Now, I do want to stress that, remember, the author and the narrator are not the same person. Think of them as kind of like Marshall Mathers, Eminem, and his Slim Shady persona. Each one of them has a distinctive point of view in Eminem's music, and they may or may not agree on ideas or even what happens. So do keep in mind that the writer of the text is not the same as the narrator, right? In fact, you may notice a conflict between what the narrator tells the reader and what we are meant to believe. So there is such a thing as an unreliable narrator. Their point of view comes from a perspective that is deceptive, either self-deceptive, deluded, or even deranged. And for this example, I do want to identify the narrator from Fight Club. Although he's the one who's telling us the story, by the end of the tale or by the end of the film, we actually learn that he was definitely not a very trustworthy person, and we should not have been believing what he was telling us. Next up, we have setting. The setting refers to the time and place of a story. Place is the where, when it comes to where a story takes place. Time is the when a story takes place. And atmosphere is often the dominant mood or feeling created by the author's use of language, images, and physical setting. Now, I have three examples here. The first comes from The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, in which we see Gandalf riding to a fantastical city which looks almost like it could never have been built in today's world. And so it does actually present a kind of fantasy setting. This just does not look like something that comes from Earth. And the second still comes from the series Hannibal, which has a much more modern setting because we can tell from the stainless steel appliances, the style of clothing, even, of course, the kitchen utensils that Hannibal is using within this scene. I will also take note, too, that this particular scene is rather dark. And if you ever worked in a kitchen, you really don't want your kitchen to be that dark. And so it creates a kind of dark or foreboding mood within the tale. And the last image I have here comes from the film Ex Machina. And as you can see, it has a kind of futuristic setting because we have a android who we can see the inner workings of, kind of looking at a mask or another kind of potential face for another android. And so this definitely doesn't seem like technology that exists in today's world, so it has a kind of futuristic time setting. Now, the tone and style of a story can be used to help an author tell their story and can also help to illuminate meaning for the reader. So, tone is the author's attitude toward the story and its characters, which can be inferred from the choice of characters, events, and especially in the author's diction or choice of words. Style is the individual traits or characteristics of a piece of writing, or a writer's particular way of managing words that we come to recognize as habitual or customary. One of the things you'll notice from Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, is that Poe's writing is definitely old-fashioned, or what we might consider to be old-fashioned today, because his sentences are long, they're complicated, and oftentimes students have a hard time with those kinds of sentences because they're not used to them. And so we're dealing with not just a different type of style from the writer, but we're also dealing with a different time frame. And that can also contribute to a reader's confusion. The last term I'm going to be using here is probably one of my favorites, and that is symbolism. Now, a symbol is a character, place, or thing that suggests more than its literal meaning. And so it's essentially, it can be anything or anyone within a story, but it's not necessarily everything within a story. It's basically what the writer or the creator wants us to pay attention to. So, for example, the apple in Western culture or Western Judeo-Christian culture has very specific symbolic value, and that, of course, is referring to the biblical tale of Adam and Eve from Eden, where Eve was seduced by Satan in the form of a serpent to eat from the tree of knowledge, and then she gave the fruit and convinced Adam to also do the same thing. Now, the symbolism of the apple typically is things like refers to things like temptation, original sin, lust, all of those things that kind of applied to the apple. And we see that working here in the cover for Twilight, where we have two what look like feminine hands holding an apple almost out to the reader, kind of daring them to try this apple. And of course, the story of Twilight is about a woman who is trying to convince a vampire to bite her in order to transform her into another vampire. And so his task is to resist her advances. And so essentially the cover reveals to us symbolically that the book is about temptation and the resistance of temptation. And all of that's revealed essentially by the artist's choice of not just the feminine looking hands, but also the choice in the apple, which is traditionally seen as the fruit that Eve gave to Adam. And so that's why things like symbolism can be very informative when it comes to text. So definitely pay attention to the items or things or people that the writer or the creator or the artist are continuously drawing our attention to. They're continually wanting us to generate meaning from that object. And so that's why symbolism can be very important and also very informative. Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.